You're listening to the Diplomats Asia Geopolitics podcast. I'm your host, Katie Putz, coming to you again from the island of Hawaii.
And this is Ankit Panda, still in the Asian region, although I am now in the Middle East, actually, in Dubai. Good to join you, Katie.
Good to talk to you again. So I think we've had some listeners request us to talk about this particular topic, so we'll get into it. In January of this year, the Chinese AI company DeepSeek released its free chatbot app for iOS and Android. Within a week, DeepSeek had surpassed ChatGPT as the most downloaded free chat app, AI chat app in Apple's App Store. Analysts said this, caused NVIDIA share price to drop nearly 20%. NVIDIA is an American company that makes computer components, including designing semiconductors and things like that, various chips. ChatGPT, of course, is a free AI chatbot created by a US company, OpenAI. And so we sort of have this flurry of commentary about great power competition in the AI space. As well as a lot of really interesting reporting on what these competing chatbots turn out and sort of the influence of the Chinese state ideology in what comes out of the chatbot. So Ankit, let's just start with DeepSeek's release in January and sort of the upset it caused. It suddenly went from nowhere to everywhere. What is unique about their chatbot, and what should our listeners know about sort of this immediate furor over this bot?
Yeah, sure. So without getting too into the weeds on artificial intelligence and large language models, so DeepSeek basically took an approach to training their model that essentially tried to incentivize reasoning, basically giving the model positive reinforcement in the way that we understand to be kind of intuitively useful for human psychology and learning, to sort of see if that would create results for a AI model. And it actually turned out that it worked really well, right? And so that is essentially part of the success. The Chinese DeepSeek R1 and V3 models have demonstrated a particularly a particular level of performance that I think was rather surprising to many in the West. And so, what I think we're talking about here, Katie, is first of all a wake up call for many in the United States that Chinese artificial intelligence capabilities are keeping up or even surpassing potentially some of what's happening in the United States by companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and Microsoft and so on. And so, this is essentially a dynamic playing out between private actors and countries. But the broader context here is really about, as you alluded to, great power competition and the role of export controls in particular. Artificial intelligence is extremely computationally intensive. And so computation is essentially a resource that requires access to computational hardware. And so the export control approach that the United States has been pursuing is to try to limit the ability of Chinese firms like DeepSeek to access the computational resources that are plentiful in the United States, but ideally should be more limited for China. The debate about DeepSeek's performance is not just what the model appears to be capable of, but whether and to what extent DeepSeek was able to execute on their design and their philosophy that I described earlier, with potentially more limited computational resources. And there is a bit of a debate here. There are
Mm-hmm.
rumors that a lot of what I think people have been overreacting to in some ways in the US and elsewhere is probably not actually that strongly based, that DeepSeek probably actually had access to more computational resources than we initially thought. But this is, an interesting moment. And I think it's great to talk about this on the podcast because of the inherent competition that I think we are seeing between the US and China on AI.
Yeah, certainly. And I think also one of the things that happens when something like this breaks into the news and you haven't been paying attention to this particular issue is it feels like it came out of nowhere and they invented this overnight. And that's clearly not true. The company DeepSeek has been around for several years, has been working on these things for several years. And so there's some complexity there that if you're not paying attention to it, which I'll be honest, I was not paying attention to this particular area. And so it can be very sudden, but there is this sort of backstory. I think my next sort of question for you, Ankit, is when we're looking at sort of the efforts the U.S. government with these export controls, particularly to sort of the higher powered semiconductors and chips and stuff like that. Is this a failure of that approach to sort of control these sort of building blocks of this higher technology? So what are your sort of thoughts on that tactic, that approach? Was this a failure of that, or was this going to happen inevitably? And I guess go a little bit deeper into what we do and don't know, because we certainly have what the company says that the money they said they spent and the efforts they say that they've done, but how verifiable is that information?
Yeah, so Katie, as you stated at the outset of this discussion, the DeepSeek phenomenon caused a significant reduction in the market capitalization of NVIDIA, right? The leader in the provision of computationally useful graphical processing units and other kind of computational hardware relevant for these artificial intelligence companies. Um, so nobody actually exactly knows what DeepSeek used to train their model. There are rumors that they actually had access to about 50,000 NVIDIA Hopper, Hopper being the previous NVIDIA generation of chips, which
Hmm.
is a lot, right? That's a lot. That's a significant amount of computational power. And so the narrative around export controls was essentially, well, so let me actually take a step back here. The whole reason we're talking about export controls is that the United States thought that export controls would be a very useful way for preventing something like this from happening, for preventing a breakout from a Chinese firm, because they would be limited in their ability to access essentially American world leading bleeding edge chips. China does not currently have the ability to compete directly with the kinds of processing units that NVIDIA is producing.
Hmm.
But if the assumption there is actually wrong, and DeepSeek actually had its hands on tens of thousands of NVIDIA chips and used that to train its model and to create this phenomenon, right? The model is real. We understand the performance, the ability for people to interact with that. That doesn't essentially blow a hole open in the export control approach. What it does suggest is that the efficiency assumptions that might have been made here, that DeepSeek was able to do something that American companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and
Hmm.
others aren't able to do, is probably actually mistaken. So there's that factor here that I think matters. But then there's another way to think about export controls and the market effects of this, which is that it's not that DeepSeek proves that export controls haven't worked or that computational units are actually less valuable. It's that there's actually more value to be gained potentially from each individual kind of compute unit, for instance. So that should actually support, for instance, the market capitalization of a country like of a company like Nvidia. So
Hmm.
that's one way to kind of look at it. The other thing that I think is interesting, of course, is this happens at the very moment that the United States is transitioning from the Biden administration, which very much prioritized export controls and other means of constraining China's ability to compete with the United States on high technology items like computational chips, to the Trump administration, which,
Hmm.
again, unknown how the Trump administration is going to handle some of this. So there was, I think, the perception that this was essentially a moment where China could try to essentially disabuse the United States of the notion that it could constrain China's ability to compete. And so that, I think, is also an interesting component of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll have to watch. I haven't seen terribly much about the Trump administration's response to this development. We're busy doing a lot of things, so maybe I missed it. But what should we be looking at next in this space, and sort of what are the lingering questions that you have going forward?
Well, so I mean, on the Trump piece, right? So we've been talking about this quite a bit in the last few episodes of this podcast, but the Trump administration, one of the first things they did was actually rescind the Biden administration's own executive order on artificial intelligence safety, and there's a lot of links between the new administration and Silicon Valley in particular, where there's been quite a bit of criticism of the attempts by the Biden administration to try and constrain American artificial intelligence innovation per se. And so I
Hmm.
think that is something to keep an eye on. The approach that the Biden administration took, I don't think, is going to persist essentially under this new administration. But the broader interest in export controls, I think that debate is still going to play out in the United States. We're recording this on February 13th. It's been a while for folks to kind of take in the implications of the DeepSeek phenomenon. I would argue that there was a bit of an overreaction in the United States initially.
Hmm.
There's also the matter that these are large language models in particular are a technology that have been improving at a rate that I think is just very difficult for policy to wrap its head around, right? I mean, on the order of kind of 2 to 3 months, we are noticeably observing qualitative improvements in a lot of this. And so, what happened in January 2025 might not tell us much about where we might be by the middle of this year, by the end of this
Hmm.
year, into next year. And so, it's entirely possible that American companies will, of course, continue to compete. I think what we really take away here geopolitically is that the artificial intelligence competition between the United States and China will continue to be high on the agenda for the United States and its allies, because there is a lot of, um, there's a broader concern here that whichever country will become the first to either get to what we call artificial general intelligence or artificial super intelligence will essentially open up potential avenues to tremendous competitive advantages and technologies that could have applications from everything from finance to military applications, and that has broader implications and ripple effects for the ability of China or the United States to accomplish national objectives. So that I think is
Hmm.
the broader context here, but there's a lot that's changing here very quickly.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I really want to at least draw out is some of the, you will see screenshots of people who have queried, both ChatGPT and OpenAI on what are perceived as sensitive issues to the Chinese state. And it's really interesting to sort of watch this response that seems very rooted in a state ideology, and that, as someone who writes for a living, it concerns me. AI certainly concerns me, but that reaching for a tool to ask questions to, and then getting specifically tailored responses that either omit what those of us sort of not living constantly on the internet would say are facts, is interesting and troubling, and I think that does impact that geopolitical uh, repercussions of sort of which end of this spectrum kind of quote unquote wins. So I'm curious on your thoughts on that. I don't think we've discussed that.
Yeah, so China has national artificial intelligence policies that emphasize the need for these models to essentially conform to the Communist Party's view of certain events, right? So yes, I mean, this has been very popular on Western social media. If you ask DeepSeek about Taiwan, about what happened on June 4th, 1989 in Beijing, you
Yeah.
will not get a particularly informative answer. That I think is, of course, in a way, it's deeply unsurprising, but I don't think it actually speaks to necessarily the broader reasoning capabilities of DeepSeek in other areas, where I think
Hmm.
we have a fairly good evidentiary basis to suggest that this is a fairly capable model, right? And so it's not the fact that the model has these built-in sort of safeguards, ideological safeguards, completely sort of neutralizes the utility of DeepSeek. That just hasn't been true in sort of my experience, at least interacting with the model. But I think the broader, there's sort of another fact here that I think is important, which is I mean, first of all, so there's been, as far as I know, unspecified cyber attacks on DeepSeek of unknown
Hmm.
origin.
Hmm.
Very interesting. Happened after the phenomenon blew up. Speculation being that this is part of either an American or Western or some non-governmental effort to try and limit the ability of people around the world to engage with the model. Um, but also, this is an open source model, and so the data protections here are interesting because you can interact with DeepSeek in your browser, which would mean that the data is locally stored within China, which of course presents privacy and information security
Hmm.
concerns. But you can also essentially run the model locally on any hardware that can support this, right? So DeepSeek is sort of similar to the Llama model, for instance, that's been promulgated by the American firm Meta, which has also been promoting an open source model. And so it's interesting to see that the first Chinese large language models really make waves and try to question the so far uncontested American leadership in this area is an open source model, because that does
Hmm.
actually allow for uh, researchers to independently audit what exactly the model is doing with the data that's being input, as long as you're running it locally on your own hardware. So I think that's a piece of this. But I think, Katie, what you're identifying is going to be a longer term concern for the competitiveness of Chinese AI firms, right? Because
Hmm.
as we, I think, have seen with the geopolitical concerns around TikTok, for instance, the fact that a lot of data will be held within Chinese borders, and that there will be these ideological guardrails essentially applied, will be, I think, a limiting factor to the appeal of
Hmm.
models like DeepSeek, R1, and so forth.
All right. Well, do you have any final thoughts on this topic? Otherwise, I think we can wrap it up.
Yeah, I think we can wrap it up. I mean, I could keep going, but I think as listeners sort of wrote in, I do think we needed to eventually get around to the artificial intelligence geopolitical contest between the United States and China, and I think we'll be coming back to this. I mean, this is certainly not
Hmm.
an issue that is going away anytime soon, and as I think you hinted at, under the Trump administration in particular, I think the close relationship between the White House and Silicon Valley and the quick changing environment and technological state of artificial intelligence will mean that this will be something that we'll just have to pay close attention to in the coming years.
Yeah, certainly, and it's maybe worth noting. Elon Musk has wanted to buy OpenAI. OpenAI's CEO has said no, this is not happening. But the domestic churning, I think, as always, will might have geopolitical implications in the future. So we'll see.
Yeah, Elon Musk wants a lot of things. I think I can say that pretty confidently right now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for listening in. We will be back soon with more. If you like this podcast, please leave us a nice review somewhere, recommend us to a friend, and you can always get in touch with us to suggest topics. We do respond to those emails, and we are thinking about those topics. So thank you very much, and we'll be back with more soon,
Thanks, Katie. Great to join you as always.
as always.